Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. My name is Otto Svensson. I'm filling in for Donatien Rui for this week's episode. Today we will discuss last week's NATO summit in The Hague, where European allies signed up to a massive new spending pledge. Then we will turn to a conversation with Sarah Hall, the 1931 professor of geography and fellow of St. John's College at Cambridge University, and the deputy director of the UK in a Changing Europe, for a conversation about the UK economy. We hope you enjoy the show. So Max, last week, NATO leaders convened in The Hague, in the Netherlands, for a much-awaited NATO summit. They signed up to a massive new defense spending pledge, 5% of GDP towards defense. 3.5% of that figure was meant to be achieved entirely through core defense spending, troops, weapons, and so forth, while the remaining 1.5% could be put towards defense-related expenditure. That includes critical infrastructure, civil preparedness and resilience, innovation, etc. So what did you think? What was your main takeaway?
So, look, I think there's sort of two different ways of seeing this summit. And I think both are very legitimate. One is to see it as a huge success, to praise Mark Rutte and his efforts to befriend Trump, to praise Trump, and to basically get NATO through this summit with the alliance still intact. So there was sort of Operation Just Keep It Going. Let's keep NATO alive. Let's just appease Trump. We'll all agree to this 5% thing, and the alliance will continue. Job well done. I kind of take a different approach, that I think Europe looked, frankly, pathetic. And I think it was another case to me of NATO kind of living on a different planet, of where Europe is politically, and also not really addressing the big elephant in the room, which is that the United States looks like it's going to be pulling massive forces out of Europe. And instead, this sort of had this feel of everything is going to be fine and Europeans are going to spend 5% on defense and defense-related items. And let's be clear, if the Europeans all spent 3.5% on defense, which is being proposed, that would give Europe a larger defense budget than the United States. The U.S. spends slightly less than 3.4%. It would also mean that the Europeans are then spending roughly $1 trillion a year. Actually, that would be just the EU would spend roughly $1 trillion a year, which would be more than the U.S. military budget. And I think what it really ignores is that by making these sort of outlandish political commitments, European countries are now on the hook for having committed to do this. And very few countries actually meet 3.5%. I'm not even sure all the Baltic states right now meet 3.5%. Now, sure, they can easily get there, but European countries aren't going to hit this. And if you try to hit this, you are going to elicit a massive political blowback inside of Europe that says, we're trading guns and butter now. We're going to start cutting healthcare. France has a deficit above 5%. The UK just did a whole strategic defense review where they could barely get to 2.5%. Now they're going to increase by another 1%. And that's going to mean cuts to the NHS. And you have Reform Party, you have Marine Le Pen, you have Mélenchon on the left. So I think Europe is setting itself up for a real political blowback by making commitments either that it intends to keep without doing reforms to how it does its defense, which we can talk about, or it doesn't intend to keep it, and then it just has given the United States a huge stick to just bang it over the head. But I'm curious what you think. Do you think, was this the right approach from Rutte and from NATO to kind of bend the knee to the United States here?
I'm more sympathetic to Rutte's approach. I think there's an element of playing for time here that I, as a European, as a Dane, is particularly sympathetic to. I think you've made the point that Portugal spending an extra percentage of its GDP on defense is not really going to make any significant difference towards the defense of Estonia. And I think that's exactly the right analysis coming from our perch as think tankers here in Washington. But there's a short-term element here that just trumps any of those structural issues that I think Europe is moving towards when you look at some of the initiatives coming out of Brussels at the moment. And it just comes down to the equipment, the forces that the U.S. currently has in Europe. And keeping that equipment, those forces in the short term just trumps whatever structural factors that you and I have argued Europe should change in the coming years?
Yeah, I guess my problem, which I didn't mention earlier, is that what I think the summit does is distract Europe from the urgent, real task that it has to figure out how to fight as Europeans. Because currently, this sort of nonsense mess of Europe presently, with all these different militaries that can't really fight together, operate different equipment, I mean, it is broken. And I think what NATO doesn't want to recognize, because it needs to rhetorically pat itself on the back and talk about how it's the strongest alliance ever, how it's ready for war. And it's true it's ready for war because of the United States. And without the United States, this is a mess. This is a total disaster. And I think you can look at NATO over the last 30 years and say this has failed. This has failed to actually create a situation where Europe is strong and can defend itself. It's reliant on the United States, despite being incredibly wealthy. Like spending 3.5% on defense is not a huge lift. But what Europe, right now would be putting good money after bad, because it would just be funneling money into all these national militaries. Would Portugal spend its money, additional 1% of GDP, in a way that actually strengthens European security? Somewhat, sure. But some of it might also go to, well, we really want to increase pensions now for our officer corps, or other things like that. And I'm just purely projecting that. It's not trying to admonish the Portuguese officer corps. But I think what is really needed is for Europe to really focus on the task of how do you replace the United States? And this was not that. This was a delusional effort by the Europeans to just pretend that nothing has changed. And so I get the buying time, and I've seen all the great rhetoric from Merz, but then I don't see really any shifts in like what Germany's approach is to anything. And there's a lot of good rhetoric, and things are happening. To be clear, the EU is doing a lot of interesting proposals, but I don't quite see the kind of seriousness to address these real gaps. And I think if NATO were serious, it would have been like, okay, the U.S. is planning force withdrawals. That's going to put more burden on us. This is what we have to do. And this was just, the summit statement was 4 paragraphs. I think it was 4 paragraphs. Was it 3? No, I think it was 4.
I think it may have been 5.
5? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Shortest NATO statement in history. And I think this was an act of self-delusion on the part of the Europeans. And one last point is I think Europeans thought by bending the knee, they were keeping the Americans in. My guess here is that when these force cuts are announced, whenever they happen, when the force posture review is done, the administration goes to Congress and says, look, Europeans committed to spend 5% on defense. They're taking care of it. We're done. We can get out. And so you're thinking that it sort of got one over on those gullible Americans. Look, we were just really nice to Trump and we appeased him and they bought it. They didn't buy it, guys. Like, they know that this is a lot of BS, that, it's 10-year commitment. Most Europeans, no intention of really meeting it. And so they're going to call you out on it. And so this is a justification, I think, for the troop cuts that Europe was hoping to avoid.
I think that's a very sensible take on the summit. But I also think it is somewhat far removed from the political reality of Europe. You call it delusional. That's definitely one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is this is pragmatic EU policymaking. You've had 3 years of conversations about common debt, various EU financing mechanisms for Europe's rearmament, and you have a situation where the divide between North and South is just still so stark. So 3 years into this conversation where the Spanish and the Italians insist on grants, not loans, not cheap loans through many of these EU financing mechanisms, you have Berlin and The Hague still staunchly, demanding that they will not be part of any sort of debt on behalf of their Southern European neighbors. So what are you supposed to do as a moderate European country in this situation where you have, a bull in a china shop on the other side of the Atlantic and you have European neighbors that can't seem to agree on the path forward? What are you supposed to do? And so I think this was probably the best of a plethora of terrible options. You got, the president to say very nice things about the alliance. He said, President Trump declared afterwards that allies' passion for their collective defense had erased much of his long-held skepticism about the alliance. And he said, I left here saying that these people really, really love their countries. It's not a ripoff, and we're here to help them protect their country. With everything else that's going on, if you can't do Eurobonds for defense, you can't do a big, trillion euro pot of financing for Europe's rearmament, this is probably the best thing you're going to get. The Americans stay in for another, at least 3 years, and then we see whatever comes after Trump.
I guess, so I think that is the logic, and I think you argued it well. I just say I don't think the Americans are staying in, right? I think, I could be wrong, but I think the troop cuts are going to be very significant. And Trump, I think, even at that summit, said that Article 5 doesn't necessarily mean that the United States has to go to war. We can basically support Europe the way we're supporting Ukraine. That would be totally in line with Article 5. There's nothing in it that actually requires us to go to war to fight the Russians. We could say, actually, we're not going to do that, but we'll send some food aid and maybe some shells to Estonia if need be. So I think it's an illusion that, or let me put it this way. I think it very well may be the case that the U.S. commitment is as it ever was. That may be the case. But if I were living in Estonia or in Europe and I was at all worried about the Russian threat, which I think all Europeans should be, I would not want to bank on this administration coming to my rescue. In part because of what they have said, and because this is an America First presidency, which does not treat and view allies with this sort of ironclad commitment that I think Europeans expect. So that's sort of what I was trying to hit at this piece. It's like, okay, if you really hate the European Union and working together as Europeans, and you really want to just maintain your, different national militaries, fine. But then you have to spend a lot more, and it's going to be a lot more costly. And I think that could engender a real political blowback from both the right and the left in Europe that just, could easily go soft on Russia and say, I don't want to trade my healthcare to fight the Russians because they're not really a threat, and I'm living in Portugal.
An excellent piece that you put out last week. Should have plugged it at the start of your comments, but NATO's brain death in The Hague summarizes many of these points very, very well. Speaking of opposition to national defense spending, I think this is a good point to pivot to the spoiler of this transatlantic love fest that Mark Rutte and Donald Trump had initiated, and that is Pedro Sanchez and Spain. So Madrid declined to sign up to this new big 5% spending pledge. And there was a great picture, they do these summit photographs with all the leaders standing on, a staircase with the NATO logos in the backdrop. And you have Pedro Sanchez standing to the far right of the picture with like a noticeable gap to the leader standing next to him, looking very aloof and very sulking at having to be there for this picture. Spain has been the laggard of European NATO allies, spending, 1.24% of its GDP on defense for the past decade, far below the 2% that was agreed to at the 2014 Wales summit. At the summit, Pedro Sanchez said that 2.1% of GDP would be plenty, and that this would be sufficient, realistic, and compatible with our social model and welfare state. This drew the ire of the American president. Trump was not pleased. He said, it's terrible what they've done. He accused Madrid of seeking a little bit of a free ride and finally stated that we're negotiating with Spain on a trade deal, but we're going to make them pay twice. So how would you assess Madrid's sort of diplomatic approach to this summit?
First, you need to work on your Trump impression. Second, so I'm going to defend Spain and you're going to attack Spain. And I think what the Spanish would say is like, okay, we don't spend a lot on defense, but we're an island. We are, protected by the Pyrenees. The security threats to us are not that significant, and we participate significantly in NATO missions. And, oh, by the way, we had a military dictatorship 50 years ago. We've just committed to hitting the 2%, and we are, on track to do that. And now you're going to, move this target up to 5%. That's ridiculous. And I think what Pedro Sanchez, and we also have to acknowledge that Pedro Sanchez has incredibly difficult domestic political situation, both through the corruption in his own party, but also he has a far left coalition partner. I already mentioned Spain, having a military dictatorship. So spending a lot more on defense is just not popular in Spain, and they don't face many threats to the nation. And look, if you are going to base defense spending at a national level, this is what you're going to get across Europe. And so it's not just Spain, it's all the other countries that aren't frontline, aren't going to invest. And I think they're the one country with the temerity to be like, this ain't happening. Like, we're not actually going to do this, not just we, Spain, but like most of Western Europe. So we're not going to commit to something that we're not going to do. And I also think there's a bit of a political element here for Spain wanting to, punch Donald Trump and look good domestically for doing that. I think the reason why Macron and others don't want to do that is for the intra-European politics of, the Eastern Europeans are desperate to just keep the current bargain going. And if, Macron were to cause a whole rift, then the Eastern Europeans would resent him, much the way that Pedro Sanchez is being pilloried, I think, in much of Europe. But I actually think that he was just being honest about where things stood.
Yes, thank you. I am incredibly sympathetic to Pedro Sanchez's political plight. It is an incredibly tenuous position he is in. With that being said, I am growing incredibly tired of the Spanish rhetoric when it comes to European defense. We're talking about the fourth largest economy in Europe. We're talking about a country that had the presidency of the Council of the European Union very recently, who sees itself as a leader of Europe, who wants to engage with the big challenges facing Europe, be it climate, being energy security. And, I would argue that the biggest one right now is a big, bad, revanchist Russia on your eastern flank. If we see Spain as a leader of Europe, then I think it's fair to expect them to rise up to this challenge and to not be the laggard of European defense spending, however flawed that metric is. You made a comment about, Spain have the Pyrenees, Russian tanks aren't going to roll in anytime soon. That's completely fair. But it is an incredibly slippery slope to start that line of rhetoric and saying, well, the Netherlands aren't close to the eastern flank. Can we expect them to get a carve-out on whatever agreements have been made? This is where the solidarity element comes in, I think. However flawed that is as a metric for defense spending. One thing I will also just say is, you mentioned, that they have been, a staunch supporter of Ukraine. Their military support has been minuscule. I think this is a stat I will always pull up as a Dane, but the fact that tiny Denmark of 6 million people have given more military aid to Ukraine than Spain, Italy, France, and Poland combined is pretty crazy to me. Again, if you want to be seen as a leader on the European stage, then step up to the challenges that are facing Europe. And we'll also say that the fact that you still have a sizable fleet of Leopard tanks behind the Pyrenees, protecting what? What are they doing behind the Pyrenees?
Rusting.
If you don't want to send them to Ukraine, and I get that they're not in great shape, but send them to Poland, send them to the Baltics, whatever. I just don't think that we're quite sort of imbuing Spain with the responsibility that a great European power should have.
I think that's entirely fair. But then I think what NATO and what Europeans need to do, and this is what I would do if I was on the eastern flank, is make specific requests. Be like, give us your tanks. Or spend more on supporting Ukraine. And this is where Kaja Kallas has tried to do that at the EU level. And there's been a lot of backbiting stories about her and she didn't follow the right procedure and trying to force member states. And I don't know if that came from Spain, but it was definitely countries where felt like they didn't want to be forced to commit to some big sum that they were contributing. And I think you're entirely right that Spain has not been carrying its weight militarily. It does have budget deficits. They would say that, Spain had to suffer for 10 years of a massive economic depression because of the euro and the euro crisis. And even though we had a budget surplus heading into the crisis and we didn't get any solidarity then. And so the solidarity argument, I think is very circular and can descend into what about, and I think is very divisive for Europe. I do think that Spain needs to be put on the spot, and it's deliver something tangible to defend Europe. Make that specific as opposed to just saying, hit 3.5%. And as we were discussing before this, Italy is going to build some bridge from Sicily to the mainland of Italy. I mean, what? How is that contributing to European defense? So that is not solidarity. That is BS. And I think my problem here is NATO just keeps focusing for the last 10 years on these targets. And all we've done at the summit is basically say the next 10 years of Max Bergman's life now is going to be every NATO summit. It's did the Europeans, they're now at 2.6%. It's God, what are we doing to ourselves? Focus on real stuff, real things, real deliverables. Have half the Spanish army go and defend Europe, whatever it may be. But I think that is what is really needed. And fortunately, there is going to be a report that we are working on that points to some real tangible things that could be done by some of the non-Eastern flank countries.
And if I can just plug one idea that you threw out in your commentary from last week, again, NATO's brain death in The Hague, go check it out. For Southern European countries, be it some combination of Spain, Italy, France, Portugal, perhaps as well, carry the annual interest burden of Eurobonds.
Yeah.
And, our new addition to the CSIS Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program, Sandra Todoar, put out a piece at the Center for European Reform not too long ago saying that if you conjured a pot of 500 billion euros, the annual interest burden of that pot would be about 15 billion euros. that is an amount that could be covered by the Southern European states. That would then benefit tremendously from those funds being dispersed.
And so, you know what would have been much better way to focus this NATO summit? Would be doing that. Would have been, okay, we're going to use the convening power of President Trump coming, Mark Rutte, twisting arms, saying everyone Southern Europeans need to agree to this. We're going to create a common pot. You're going to fund it. And Spain then says yes to that. But instead, we're just agreeing to mythical targets that no one has an intention of agreeing to. So I think that that's my biggest problem, is that there's a lot that needs to be reckoned with, a lot of reforms, a lot of changes. There's a lot of good ideas out there, and we're going to throw out a bunch of good ideas. But Europeans need to start wading through those ideas, picking and choosing, and then develop a plan to go forward to try to ensure their own security. And I don't think they're doing that. But with that, I think we should transition to the interview with Sarah Hall.
We are thrilled to welcome Sarah Hall to the Europhile. Sarah is a 1931 professor of geography and fellow of St. John's College at Cambridge University. Her work focuses on the uneven impacts of profound economic change, including Brexit, China's shifting economic position on the world stage, and the rise of finance-led capitalism. She's also the deputy director and senior fellow for UK in a Changing Europe, a think tank that provides impartial, research-based analysis of the UK's relationship with the EU. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
So we're going to start by setting the stage. Basically, since the official entry into force of Brexit and then COVID, there's been a lot of talk about where the UK stands economically, including as part of the G7. It's often compared to its peer nations economically and potentially in a difficult economic situation. We've seen some cuts in growth forecasts, a slow recovery out of COVID. So let's start by giving us a realistic picture. What is the current economic situation in the UK?
Yeah, so I think not entirely unlike a number of other G7 economies, perhaps with the exception of the US. The UK has really struggled to deliver sustained economic growth since it left the EU and also since COVID. I think though actually in the case of the UK, one of the kind of key drivers of this lower growth appears to be lower productivity compared to other G7 economies. And actually you can trace that lower productivity back to the financial crash. So I think although the picture looks probably worse in terms of growth for the UK than several other G7 economies in recent years, I think it's really important to locate that in a sort of longer set of challenges that, the 2007-8 crash hit the UK economy particularly hard because of its strengths in financial services. And when you look at data, particularly growth, productivity, and kind of employment in key sectors like financial services has been flatter since the 2007-8 crash than for some other G7 economies. I think then the challenge that the UK has faced is that you then have overlaid on that a number of macroeconomic challenges, some of which are quite unique to the UK, like leaving the EU, but some of which are really not. So the impacts of the COVID pandemic, the energy price shock following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example. So I feel like the UK entered this period of kind of macroeconomic turbulence already with some economic challenges in train. But yeah, it's definitely the case that there seems to be a sort of persistent challenge to deliver growth in the UK economy at the moment.
It's interesting what you said around employment being flatter in financial services, because I think we all have a picture of the UK economy being quite dominated by financial services, especially with the city. Can you explain how these two things work together, or if maybe the financial services have less of a share in the economy now?
So I think when you look at UK financial services, you can see different kind of time periods in its recent experience. So financial services employment was growing really quite rapidly in the UK up until the 2007-8 crash. There was then a period of retrenchment, and the growth rate in employment since then has not matched the growth rate in employment that was experienced before the 2007-8 crash. On the face of it, you might think, does that mean that financial services still aren't as important in the UK economy? I mean, the UK is still dominated by financial services, particularly financial services and related professional services. So the sector that seems to be growing really rapidly in the UK at the moment are kind of what the Office for National Statistics here calls other business services. And they've overtaken financial services recently in terms of export. So that's things like legal services, consulting services. And I think we actually need more research to really understand what's going on there, because I think some of those services are very closely related to financial services. So something like legal services, whether you can tease those two apart or not, I'm not so sure. There's also a question about whether we are fully accounting for new forms of financial services work. So things like fintech, for example, doesn't fit very neatly within official statistic classification. I think some of them will be showing up as kind of IT or computer related jobs when really we would see them more commonly as financial jobs. So I think the UK is still quite heavily reliant on financial services. And actually that might be part of where the productivity challenge is for the UK, and that productivity in financial services doesn't seem to be as high as it was in the run-up to the 2007-8 crash. And so it follows that if you're an economy that relies on financial services and that's not performing as strongly, that's going to create a challenge.
So I want to move to what the government is trying to do about this. They came into power with a pretty tall order to get the economy back on track. Obviously, the Labour government of Sir Keir Starmer, there was a lot of hard decisions they had to make given the numbers that they were given when they came in. Some of that obviously completely out of the control of the previous government when we think about COVID. So I'm curious how you assess their response to this picture. What are the priorities to revive the economy? We've seen a lot of numbers coming out of the spending review, and obviously there's some difficult trade-offs that they're making. So can you talk to us about what seems to be the emerging strategy from this government and the potential trade-offs that this implies?
Yeah, I think, I totally agree that kind of growth is the kind of guiding star really of the Starmer administration. But it's trying to deliver that in very difficult circumstances. Particularly, there's been this long-standing hunt for productivity across the UK, which appears to be challenging. I think one of the strengths of the current administration is that they are quite significantly focused on longer term initiatives that don't fit very neatly actually within electoral cycles, but they hope will deliver growth. So here I draw particular attention to things like they've announced a quite radical set of reforms of planning in the UK to try and stimulate more building and construction, particularly house building, and the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is a unit in the UK that kind of evaluates policy, has now included a sort of relatively modest, but has included a kind of growth dividend from that house building programme in kind of future growth estimates for the UK. I think what's quite interesting about the kind of focus on construction and house building is that this is quite significantly focused on large cities, not necessarily London. And there's quite clear evidence that kind of increasing the agglomeration of UK kind of regional centres, so places like Manchester and Birmingham, Leeds, would be a good set of policy initiatives to make to stimulate growth. And some of the academic research suggests that the kind of UK's economic challenges lie in its comparative underperformance of these kind of regional cities compared to comparable cities in Europe. So I think that project looks quite positive. There are other kind of place-based initiatives, if you like, that the government has set out. So it's quite interested in a kind of high growth corridor between Oxford and Cambridge, and partly based around the universities, but also based around the kind of industrial spin-outs from those. And so it's focusing on what's known as the Oxford-Cambridge arc, and has a sort of infrastructure plan connecting those two cities, but also kind of wider towns and cities in that kind of southeast belt. Again, there's quite clear rationales as to why you might want to focus on those parts of the UK, although it has been kind of identified for growth before, and it's quite hard, I think, to deliver the sort of transport connectivity that kind of growth agenda is built around. And then there's also a series of kind of infrastructure improvements, particularly around airport expansion around London, for example, and a high-speed rail link between London and Birmingham. These are a bit more challenging, I think. So the airport expansion programme has come in for quite significant criticism on environmental grounds. And I think there's also a concern with that programme and to an extent the Oxford-Cambridge arc about whether that's focusing on London and the southeast at the expense of the rest of the UK. So that's quite unusual or striking for a Labour government that usually or typically has its kind of core voters not in London and the southeast. So you've had a series of infrastructure and sectorally focused announcements. Just this week, in fact, today we're expecting the launch of their industrial strategy, and that's quite important for the UK. A lot of critics argue that particularly under previous administrations, the UK has really lacked a comprehensive industrial strategy. And so that's been broadly welcomed. I think one of the bigger challenges, though, is that quite a lot of these policy announcements are likely to yield growth in the medium to longer term. And one of the big trade-offs is that some of the policies that have already been put in place by the Starmer administration are argued to have actually made growth harder in the shorter term. And in particular, the UK faces a really tight fiscal situation currently, partly because Rachel Reeves has set out quite a strict set of spending rules, and partly because in the run-up to the election, Labour committed to not raise the kind of three main taxation avenues that are open to you in the UK, income tax, national insurance and VAT. So partly to try and address this really tight fiscal situation. And so there's quite a lot of debate about whether the sort of slightly stronger growth we saw in Q1 2025 is the blip or is April the blip. And I think when you look at particularly employment, it looks like the sort of trajectory might be more like what's happened since April. So slightly less positive than some of the Q1 figures.
This is an interesting picture for a Labour government in the UK. You talked a little bit about place-based initiatives. How do you assess how the government is trying to touch different parts of the UK? Obviously, the last few years, we've seen Labour lose a lot of votes in what used to be some red strongholds, especially in the north. Are we seeing signs in the spending plans that they are trying to target some of those areas, some of the what we've talked about as quote unquote left behind areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a year now since this administration came in, and I think actually you can already see a bit of a shift on this. So I think early on in the administration, so in 2024 in particular, the focus seemed in some ways a little bit less concerned about the kind of so-called red wall or inverted commas left behind places. And in many ways, that's not surprising. The government has a huge majority by UK standards. And actually, you know, with that size of majority, you would expect them to be really quite bullish about the sort of plans that you can put in place. And so in the early part of the sort of first 6 months of the administration, you know, you saw the kind of focus on infrastructure spending in London and the southeast. I think what's happened since then is a growing concern about the rise of Reform, which is a far-right party in the UK, which has done very well in local council elections held this calendar year. And so now what you're seeing is much more of a concern within the government for thinking about what are usually seen as Labour strongholds, but actually have been polling quite strongly for reform recently. So these are places like you mentioned, kind of former industrial towns, often in the Midlands and the north of England. And when Rachel Reeves made her kind of spending plan announcement, a lot of that speech was mentioning specific places. It was quite striking for that. I think what's really interesting is that the government so early on in its administration seems to be so concerned about the rise of Reform. You know, Reform is not a major party within Westminster currently, but I think there's a real sense that UK politics is at something of a turning point, potentially a move to a more kind of multi-party system. So I think there's something really, really interesting going on there. And I think that's why you've started to see a bit more of a focus on kind of what the Labour Party is doing in local constituencies around things like kind of house building in particular cities, for example. I think the other part of the equation that we haven't mentioned, but that is really important, is that Labour has inherited the need to spend quite significantly on public services and the NHS in particular. And the NHS is something of a sort of totemic issue within UK politics. I think it's quite hard to kind of understand its place outside of the UK. But one of the major announcements in the spending review was an increase on health spending. And there's really good reasons for that. When you look at the polling in terms of people's concerns, the NHS always scores very highly. But also, and this comes back to your earlier points about COVID, the NHS has really struggled to get back up on its feet after COVID. And so I think the NHS spending is very much in line with what you would expect for Labour, really trying to use public spending to support health. Now, of course, if you have that big health spending and you have a big, as yet unfunded and growing spending commitment on defence, then it does seem increasingly likely that further tax rises are going to need to be announced in the autumn 2025 budget. It's very hard to see how those two big spending commitments can be met without that, even kind of making cuts to so-called unprotected budgets, so other government departments.
I agree that it's hard to see how that happens. And obviously, I'm sure the government would prefer not to have to announce this, but this is the situation it faces, and honestly, other countries in the region too. Speaking of the region, I want to switch to a slightly bigger, larger aperture here and talk a little about the relationship with the EU. We saw a big announcement recently with a new agreement between Brussels and London that includes things around cross-border trade, which I'm sure was quite welcome in London and probably in Northern Ireland as well. The announcement was big, but I'm curious about what you make of the realistic impact this is likely to have. There's obviously still some unresolved issues left over from many, many years of talking about Brexit and trying to implement the idea of it. But there's a lot of kinks that are very hard to work out because of the structure, because of how the single market works, and because of obviously political realities in the UK. What do you make of the agreement that was announced? And is that also likely to help boost some of the growth numbers that we get out of London?
So I think the announcement is best kind of located within a sort of slight change in the mood music between the UK and the EU that came into effect after the conclusion of the Windsor Framework under Rishi Sunak. So up until then, relations between the two sides had been pretty frosty, and that is reflected in the trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU, which represents quite a hard Brexit for the UK in particular. So the EU met many of its negotiating objectives in its strengths with the UK on manufacturing. The UK didn't meet many kind of objectives in terms of supporting its cross-border trade on services. And so you're left with quite a hard Brexit from the UK point of view, which is borne out in the kind of economic figures. I think we can debate the scale of that, and economists do. But I think, however big that is, there's an agreement that it has led to a negative impact on UK trade with the EU. I think the issue... So after the Windsor Framework, and certainly under Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister and now Sir Keir Starmer, there's definitely growing kind of trust-based relationships between the two sides. And I think that was what underpinned the recent UK-EU summit. I think also some of the kind of geopolitical tensions internationally are leading to quite a strong agenda for cooperation between the two sides. So issues around Ukraine, energy security, defence cooperation and security, and kind of tariff changes coming from the US. All of these give a bit of impetus to kind of closer working relationships. I think the challenge, though, is delivering meaningful change within what is still a very difficult political questions, both big P and small p in the UK. And so for that reason, I think whilst the summit was welcomed by both sides and does make some important changes around kind of SPS and product safety, in terms of really moving the dial on trade between the two sides, I don't think the outcome of the summit necessarily does that. And there are still some quite big areas. So around, for example, youth mobility or the mobility of kind of business travellers, the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, which I think would start to have more of an economic impact, they haven't really been addressed thus far. So I think it's definitely a kind of positive step in terms of thinking about the economic relationship between the two sides, but there's still quite a large number of issues that remain sort of TBC, if you like.
I want to end because we sit in Washington here at CSIS. I have to ask, and because that's another part of this growth or lack thereof picture, is the relationship with the United States. We saw the prime minister come to Washington recently. It seems he's developed a decent relationship with President Trump. We heard news of a deal on tariffs, although, again, the numbers here are quite important because it doesn't entirely do away with the tariffs, but it helps at least with some UK exports to the US around cars and potentially steel. What's the prospect for this? Is this similar to what we were talking about with the EU, change in the mood music, as you were saying, or that actually has the potential to help deliver some economic dividends for the UK, depending on where the final agreement lands?
So I think the big issue here, and the sort of, I'd say, slightly unknown issue, is can Sir Keir Starmer kind of maintain his commitments to the EU and the US simultaneously, or will the UK face trade-offs? So that is a really thorny set of questions for the UK. So it does appear that the UK has carved out something of a special relationship with the US administration. I think that might partly come down to raw economics, in that the US doesn't run a significant trade deficit with the UK. And I think that has really helped in terms of making the case for some of the tariff carve-outs that the UK has achieved. These do appear to be quite helpful, particularly for the UK automotive sector. In terms of the kind of so-called economic prosperity deal, there's a lot of uncertainty beyond the tariff proposals about what that actually is. And indeed, I think one really interesting issue to watch is the kind of proposed tariff changes on steel and aluminium, which haven't been signed off recently, unlike those for automotive. Partly, I think, because the UK needs to kind of demonstrate the sort of origins of some of the steel and steel products that it's exporting to the US and how they fit within kind of security concerns from the US side. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. But I think on the other hand, that EPD document was seen as something of an achievement, in that it didn't open the UK market up to chlorinated chicken, for example, which is a very big issue in the UK around food standards. But I think probably more importantly, didn't preclude the UK from securing what it wanted to do on food standards with the EU. So it managed to keep that kind of channel open. So I think it does appear that the UK has managed to adopt something of a special position within the sort of geopolitics of the Trump administration. I think the challenge there is how the UK then uses that in its relationship with the EU as well, and whether the EU views the UK as something of maybe a fickle negotiator that is prepared to kind of try and negotiate first with the US and then see what that means for its position with the EU. And I think that EPD, partly there's a lot of uncertainty on some of the tariff aspects of it. There's also uncertainty because US tariff policy itself is highly uncertain, I would say, still. But also half of that EPD document set out kind of future aspirations around things like sort of digital services and other parts of the economy. And that doesn't look to me like a kind of full-blooded FTA with between the UK and the US that some people have been suggesting might have been on the table, but looks like a series of sort of sector-specific deals. And I don't actually think we know what form that's going to take.
Make a really important point about the triangulation that needs to happen in London between its relationship with the US and its relationship with the EU, and especially because of the challenges we faced since the Brexit vote in 2016 around what the single market requires, what trade with the EU requires, which is at times pretty stringent, might tie the hands of a UK administration that is also trying to get benefits from its relationship with the US, which is always, of course, the promise that was made. It's like, once we're out of the EU, we can do anything. It turns out it's quite hard to live up to that promise. But I think that's a great place to leave it on the US note. Once again, a lot of announcements, a lot of uncertainty, but I'm very glad that we were able to have this conversation, and hopefully we can continue to have it because I'm sure lots of changes still on the horizon for the UK economy. But Sarah, thanks so much for joining the Eurofile.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.